The Billionaire's Crush. Luck Lake Short Reads Romance. Written by Bree Livingston. Narrated by Liz Crane. Chapter 1. Luck Lake, South Dakota wasn't the vibrant, bustling town Pierce Westwood remembered from his childhood. Over the last 20 years, the year-round vacation resort town nestled in the Black Hills had become a ghost town. As he slowly drove down Main Street, dilapidated buildings with boarded-up windows and doors lined both sides of the street, where unique shops, artist galleries, and gourmet restaurants once beckoned tourists to stroll on the sidewalk and take in the sights. In a stroke of luck, he'd run across the town in a bankruptcy auction and purchased it a few months prior. He'd gone so far as to create a separate LLC for it, since it was less about profit and more about love. He hoped to renovate the hotel and incentivize businesses to return. He wanted visitors to have a chance to experience it like he had as a kid. Parking his father's restored 70s Bronco in front of the hotel, he stepped out and raked his gaze from one side of the mountain-framed building to the other. It was nothing like the scenery in Dallas. With a heavy sigh, he took stock of the repairs it needed. The contractor he'd hired had already visited the area, giving Pierce a good picture of the money and time it would take to restore it. The hotel exterior was covered in dirt and moss, and some of the logs were now dried out and splintered. The windows were boarded up, the railings were weathered, and the roof needed extensive work. That was only the outside. From the pictures on the auction website, the interior was in even worse shape. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with crisp, clean mountain air that brought back memories of the time he'd spent there. Swimming in the cold streams, fishing and hiking with his dad in the summer. Snowball fights, sledding, and carriage rides in the winter. As a kid, he'd looked forward to it. He stepped back from the Bronco, swung the door shut, and walked to the back of the vehicle. Normally, he'd invest in a project and then leave it to the people he hired, but this place meant something to him, so he'd be staying on site until it was finished. His contractor would be arriving shortly with one of the RVs Pierce rented for them for the duration of the job. He'd provided for the crew as well. "Who are you?" The sudden sound of a voice startled Pierce, and he turned to find the source. All that crisp air felt sucked away in an instant. Bethany Holland. The name danced through his mind with a sigh following it. Wow. Age had only made her more beautiful. The last time he'd vacationed with his family, he had no idea he wouldn't see her again until now. Dressed in a white t-shirt and jeans, she stood with her arms folded over her chest, auburn hair hitting her shoulders and her bright blue eyes boring through him as she waited for an answer. His pulse jumped as the crush he'd felt as a 12-year-old flooded back. They'd hung out as kids, but mostly in groups. He was one of a sea of faces to her, most likely. If anyone would have asked him back then, he'd have sworn he was in love with her. "I asked you a question?" Not an ounce of recognition in her eyes, but not unsurprising. She was popular, and his crush was only one of a dozen. She was the girl everyone wanted to be around. "Hello?" Pierce shook his head, sticking his hand out to shake hers.
"Oh, yeah, I'm..."
Should he tell her? He'd been such a nerd back then. Not the cute kind, either. If there was a possibility of putting his foot in his mouth, he'd find it. The magical memories were now replaced with cringeworthy recollections and groans of embarrassment. Would putting his face to his name spark any sort of memory? He'd used Pierce as a kid, and he intended to tell her that.
"Chuck Westwood,"
he replied, shocked he'd thrown his middle name out instead. "Bethany Holland." Her head tilted as she shook his hand, like his name seemed to trigger a memory. The hope died when she stiffened. So, you're the one who outbid us?
Outbid?
Uh-huh. Outbid. People in the town pooled their money. We love our home and didn't want some outsider coming in here and changing everything. She worked her jaw. We thought we had it, and then some corporation swooped in and stole it from under us. Pierce was a little shocked at the animosity spewed in his direction. Then again, fighting injustice was a Bethany trademark, just like when they were children. The summer Pierce was 8, a new guy showed up and thought he was going to rule the place, but she'd quickly put him in his place. This was her town, and she was the boss. Bethany may as well have worn a Supergirl suit. At the time, it was the very definition of epic.
I didn't steal anything. There was a minimum bid, and it hadn't been reached yet. Nowhere did it indicate someone else was interested. I had no idea another offer was even made. All I saw was that the reserve hadn't been met.
He made sure his tone was soft. The last thing he wanted was to create an enemy, especially one he was seriously attracted to. She narrowed her eyes. We were working on that.
How, exactly?
He chuckled and immediately realized he'd made an error. Bethany's lips pinched together and she huffed. It's none of your business. With as many companies as he'd purchased, he dealt with his share of owners who hadn't wanted to let go. He wasn't the bad guy, but that's how they saw it. It wasn't his fault that they'd poorly managed their businesses. While a few families lived there year-round and called Luck Lake home, most were visitors. The townspeople hadn't kept up with the times or freshened things up. Once they'd realized their mistake and tried to fix it, it was too late. Notes had come due, and the debt collectors didn't care that the place was more than just a name and dollar amount. Pierce crossed his arms over his chest.
I don't want to get off on the wrong foot, but someone was going to buy it because you didn't have the funds. Didn't my contractor tell you the idea is to renovate and reopen?
She rolled her eyes. Yeah, but I've seen your kind before. Everything that makes this place magical is going to be torn down because new, she said, hooking fingers around the word, somehow makes things better.
Well, I wouldn't want to spend my vacation in a resort boasting a leaky roof, old carpet, and beds from the 50s.
He dropped his arms to his sides.
Just because something is new doesn't mean it has to overpower what makes the place special.
Right. And I'm supposed to believe that? Bethany raked her gaze from the top of his head to his feet. Mr. Suit and Tie with $1,000 loafers isn't going to overpower anything? Clearly, subtlety isn't your strongest attribute. The stench of your cologne could be smelled a mile away. As discreetly as possible, Pierce inhaled. He'd used aftershave, but he didn't think it was that heavy. He could barely smell it when he first applied it, and that had been hours ago.
By what? A dog?
Her mouth dropped open as her hands went to her hips. She snapped it shut with her bottom lip jutting out in a pout. Man, those lips. He didn't remember them being so kissable. Well, I guess us Midwesterners are too low for the likes of someone like you. She spun on her heels, stomping off in the direction of a small, grungy-looking diner/convenience store across from the hotel. Well, there went his hopes of getting local input. A soft sigh escaped as he hung his head. If she still held the sway she had back then, he'd just set himself against the entire town. Chapter 2. What a complete jerk! The nerve of that guy, rolling into town all rich and smug. Bethany Holland yanked the diner door open and stomped over to the table where her older brother sat. "That's him!" She plopped down on the edge of the booth across from Matthew. "That's the guy who bought the town." Matt glanced out the window.
What did he say?
She crossed her arms over her chest. "He said we wouldn't have won the auction anyway, that we hadn't met the reserve."
He's got a point.
Scoffing, she leaned back as she looked at her brother. "You're supposed to be on my side, the town side." Now that the Bradens had moved away, that made what? 9 people. They'd raised all of a few $100s. The will to keep the town locally owned was mighty, but the funds were mousy.
I am, but we haven't even collected half of the reserve.
Matt sighed.
Bethany, there's no chance a bank would have loaned us that money. It just wasn't happening.
No way was she admitting Matt was right. The banker had practically laughed in her face, but she'd kept that part of the meeting to herself. She'd felt so humiliated. Her business plan was all wrong. The needed renovations would be extensive, and she'd never run a company before. Well, not one as big as a town. The diner convenience store was as far as her experience went, and she shared that with her brother. Matt took a sip of his coffee.
At least he's here. That's a good sign, right?
She turned to face her brother, casting a quick glance at the forest green Bronco. It was old, but the paint sparkled like it had been restored with no money spared. If she were honest, she might even say she was a little jealous, until he called her a dog. "Well, he called me a dog." Her brother lifted an eyebrow.
Now, why don't I believe that?
"I told him his disgusting cologne could be smelled a mile away, and he said, 'By what? A dog?'" She mimicked the smug jerk's voice. Confessing to her brother that the guy actually smelled amazing wasn't happening. So what if he looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine with his thick head of dirty blonde hair and mesmerizing eyes? It would be hard not to admit he was attractive. That handshake had rocked her back in her boots. Lightning skittering across her nerves nearly made her swallow her tongue. Besides, girl talk with her brother was less than satisfying. If their aunt and uncle were still living in Luck Lake, Bethany would at least have a woman to talk to. Although, her aunt would probably be fawning all over the guy. For a second, when he'd first turned around, she'd had the strangest sensation that she knew him. His face struck her as familiar, but she'd come up empty after searching her memory. Spending her summers with tourists was just part of living in a resort town. Many of the families who visited the place loved it enough to return year after year. When he called himself Chuck, the feeling of familiarity had disappeared. With a name like that, she would have remembered him.
He wasn't calling you a dog.
Was too.
No, he wasn't.
Matt laughed and finished the rest of his coffee.
You're just looking for a reason to hate him because he bought Luck Lake.
Bethany groaned. "This is our home. I just don't want him messing things up." Matt stood.
Then maybe your time would be better spent helping him instead of alienating him. It sounds like he was trying to be friendly.
He tipped his head toward the hotel.
Why not talk to him? Find out exactly what he had planned. Wouldn't it be easier to change his mind if you played the part of his friend instead of crazed local?
When she didn't reply, Matt raked his hand through his hair.
Look, all I'm saying is that honey is better than vinegar. You want a say in how this town survives? He's the one you need to get chummy with.
I really hate it when you're right. Her brother smiled.
You must hate me a lot.
Bethany swung out, trying to smack him on the leg. Shut up! She scrunched her nose at him. Fine, I'll cozy up to him, see what he has planned, and go from there. I guess it can't hurt.
Exactly.
Her brother strolled to the front of the store as a car pulled into the store's parking lot. Bethany twisted in the seat to check out the visitor. More than likely, as with most of their customers, they'd taken the wrong exit and were completely lost. Unlike 2 decades ago, these travelers wouldn't have any interest in staying. She couldn't fault them either. Not only was her brother right, but that Chuck guy was too. The entire town needed a makeover, especially if she ever wanted to see it return to its former glory with families filling the streets and shopping on the main square. Facing the window, she watched Mr. Suit enter the hotel. All right, she'd make an effort and talk to the guy. If she didn't like what he had to say, she'd figure out a way to convince him her idea was better. Chapter 3. It was worse than Pierce thought. Of course, he'd seen the pictures the contractor had taken, but it was so much worse in person. The ceiling was littered with water stains, and the musty smell was overwhelming. As much as he wanted to stay in the hotel, he'd be staying in the tent he'd packed, and he was glad his mom had suggested it. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed her to let her know he'd arrived safely. "Oh, good. I'm so glad you remembered to call." Losing his dad in a car accident a few months back had pushed his already worrisome mom over the edge.
"Yeah, Mom, I'm okay. This town isn't."
Her deep breath filtered through the phone.
"Well, you knew it would be a project. I did warn you."
He smiled.
"I know, and I'm thankful you suggested the RVs. We're going to need them." "I had a feeling." She paused. "Any of the locals find you yet?" "Oh, yeah," he replied. "A woman was very upset I'd outbid her." He'd keep his attraction to his one-time crush to himself for the moment. He didn't need his mom trying to marry him off to someone who clearly held disdain for him. "That's typical, but I'm sure once she sees what you're doing, she'll come around. We had so many good memories there." She sniffed. "Your dad would love it." Pierce turned in a circle, slowly inspecting the front lobby. "Why did we stop coming here?" A rustling came through the phone like she was switching ears. "That was about the time your dad's company increased its business. We just didn't have time to take long vacations anymore." "Yeah." That first year they missed. It was supposed to be just that once. Then the next year rolled around, and then the next. Before long, the place drifted from memory. It wasn't until Pierce lost his dad that it came to mind. Finding it for sale had been a sign. At least, he'd thought so. "Well, I'm going to be here a while. There's just so much to do." "Are you sure it can be saved?" "The contractor said it could be, but that's another reason I'll be here. To make sure it's done exactly as I want, and to make sure the things that made it great are kept intact." It was true to an extent. Mostly, he just wanted a break. His dad's death had reminded him that life was about more than work and creating wealth. His time on Earth wasn't guaranteed. He wanted a wife and a family and memories. Money bought a lot of things, but it had never bought happiness. "You really did love it there? Your dad and I wondered if you'd move there one day." It wasn't the worst idea ever. He could live here and run the company. Maybe it would even help with the stress. It couldn't hurt to give it a trial run. "It's tempting." Another call beeped in, and Pierce looked at the phone. "Oh, hey, Mom, that's Ash. I need to take this." They said quick goodbyes, and he answered. "Hey, Ash, I'll be right there." Ash Bishop was a longtime friend of Pierce's. They'd met years ago when Pierce was considering a house-flipping business. Ash had come in, given him estimates, and stuck to them, which, in house-flipping, was essential if a profit was to be made.
Pierce shoved his phone in his pocket and went outside, extending a hand as he reached the man.
Hey!
He smiled.
You made it!
Ash chuckled.
I wouldn't have if you hadn't told me about the road fork and which direction to take. That road sign needs to be replaced. It's on the agenda.
Pierce sighed and faced the resort.
So, how long before we've got it at least somewhat functional?
Ash crossed his arms over his chest.
I'd say at least a month, depending on how long the mold remediation takes. If that isn't as extensive as I think it is, it'll shave off a lot of time.
He pointed to the roof.
That's first, though. I checked the weather here. It's not common to get snow in early fall, but it does happen. We certainly don't need more work from snow damage if we want to meet the deadline. Yeah, I agree.
Pierce looked over his shoulder.
Did you check out the RV? What do you think?
It's really nice. Laughing, Pierce replied.
Good, because mine is being delivered in a couple of hours.
Ash hooked a thumb toward the RV.
I'm going to take it to the campground and get it set up. The crew is on its way now, so we can get started in the morning. Sure, that...
His sentence tapered off as Bethany walked toward them. When she reached them, she hooked her fingers in the belt loops of her jeans and rocked back on her heels. Hi.
Hi.
Pierce's pulse jumped and his mouth went dry.
This is Ash Bishop. He's the contractor I hired to renovate the hotel. Ash, this is Bethany Holland.
Nice to meet you. Her gaze flicked from Pierce to Ash and back.
You too.
Ash lifted his hand in a small wave.
I'll talk to you later.
Nodding, Pierce replied,
Yeah, thanks.
He turned his attention to Bethany. His heart and his brain needed to cool it. Neither of them seemed to be listening to reason at all. She wouldn't be interested in him, especially when she realized he was the same dork from 20 years ago. What was he even thinking that for? She probably had a boyfriend. A huge lumberjack boyfriend who could rip Pierce into shreds and hide his body in the woods if he even thought a guy was flirting with his girlfriend. Pierce wanted a family, ached for one. But what were the odds that he'd run into the girl he'd crushed on from his childhood? Aside from that, she wasn't exactly a huge fan of his at the moment. Most likely, all she wanted was to make sure he didn't mess up her town. He needed to keep that in mind, especially where his heart was concerned. Chapter 4. Bethany was taking her brother's advice to heart. In the time it took her to walk from the gas station back to the hotel, she'd come to terms with the town she loved being nothing like it was when she was a kid. Once she was alone with Chuck, she toed the ground. I'm really sorry about earlier. I wasn't expecting anyone to arrive so quickly, and you took me by surprise. She chewed her bottom lip and stopped rocking on her feet. I was wondering if we could start over. Chuck held her gaze a moment before smiling.
I'd like that.
He nodded toward the hotel.
Would you like me to give you the details of the renovation? I'd love some input.
Was he just being smooth to get her off his case, or was he being genuine? Normally, she'd say the latter, but after her last boyfriend, she wasn't trusting anyone using her gut anymore. I'd like that. Her heart sank as she looked at the old hotel. Another check mark by her brother's list of things he was right about. Why had she even tried to get a bank loan? There was so much work to be done. She touched the spot over her heart, wishing it didn't hurt so much to see the place so dull and lifeless.
I know we got off to a rocky start, but could you tell me what happened? Why was it allowed to get so run down?
Chuck asked as they reached the top of the steps. My aunt and uncle owned it. They raised my brother and me. She smiled, motioning to the convenience store with her hand. He and I own that. It's the only thing in town that wasn't leveraged for loans. Chuck held the door for her.
Did tourism just dry up, or?
Bethany passed by him into the house and discreetly took a deep breath. Oh man, he smelled even better when she wasn't picturing him with horns and a pitchfork. Slowly, then bills got behind and creditors came looking for their money. Next thing I knew, there was a foreclosure sign on the door, and I was looking for answers from my aunt and uncle. They just couldn't keep up with the maintenance, and they couldn't afford to hire anyone. A few years ago, they packed up and moved to Texas. Warmer climate. My aunt has bad knees, and the cold makes it hard for her to walk.
But you own the store.
Chuck stopped next to her in the lobby. Nodding, she replied, Yep, it's all we have now.
Maybe this is prying too quickly, but does the store make much money?
Enough that we can live on it. My brother and I have tiny houses on the edge of town. Chuck's eyebrows shot up.
Tiny houses?
She laughed. He wasn't the only one to have that sort of reaction. Yep, it's about the size of a small apartment. It has everything I need, just the right amount of space for me and Mr. Floof. When his eyebrows knitted together, she added, My cat.
You call him Mr. Floof?
He's huge and white and soft, so yes, I call him Mr. Floof, she said, narrowing her eyes slightly. Holding up his hands, Chuck said,
No judgment from me.
He laughed.
My housekeeper is taking care of my cat while I'm here. Once the resort is fixed up, I'll be bringing him here when I vacation.
You plan to vacation here? Her voice rose an octave.
Yeah,
he said, looking around the room.
My family came.
He stopped short and cleared his throat.
We came through here once.
What was it with her and liars? That's why her last relationship hadn't worked out. She'd caught Sam in too many lies. Not that she was even thinking in terms of relationships or boyfriends, but she wasn't ready for another shady guy. You just lied to me. He faced her.
It wasn't a complete lie. We did come through here, each summer and winter.
Summer and winter? Her mouth slowly dropped open. Then I know you, but I don't remember anyone named Chuck.
Probably because I didn't use my middle name.
He shot her a devilishly cute half-smile. Then what's your first name? Laughing, he shook his head.
I'm not telling.
Her mouth dropped open. Why? Chuck shrugged.
How about have dinner with me?
She crossed her arms over her chest, studying him. He'd vacationed here winter and summer. There was no way she didn't know him.
Look, I just didn't want to lie to you.
His gaze dipped to the floor.
I know what that's like, and it's not fun. Have dinner with me. If it's the worst time ever, I'll leave you alone.
So weird, but also a little exhilarating. The vibe she got from him was that he was a nice guy. What was the worst that could happen? All right, dinner. When?
Whenever you're ready.
She chewed the inside of her cheek while she studied him. Maybe she could get a few clues and figure out who he was if she stalled for a little while. A week. That'll give me time to get to know you a little before then.
Okay.
He stuck out his hand.
Deal.
Well, Chuck wasn't anything like she was expecting. Maybe she needed to swallow her judgment a little and give the guy a chance. It wouldn't hurt to give him a little rope. Hopefully. Chapter 5. After spending part of the afternoon going over renovation plans with Ash, Pierce was able to park his Bronco next to the RV he'd rented and get things organized. Once that was done, he had a small meal and decided it was nice enough outside to enjoy a run. His feet had barely hit the trail, and his mind was already on Bethany again. He couldn't believe he'd asked her out, or that she'd agreed. Granted, it would depend on how the week went, but she'd said yes, so in his book, it was a win. When she came into view a little farther up the trail, he slowed just long enough to debate whether he should catch her or not. She did say she wanted to get to know him. Wasn't now as good a time as any? The question was barely a formed thought as his feet pounded the dirt faster to catch up with her. What was it about this woman that had him so flustered? He didn't even know her anymore. But he could get to know her, his heart reminded him.
Hey!
He called out. When she screamed, he realized she hadn't heard him and grimaced. She turned and faced him, hand over her heart. I'm not used to anyone being on this trail.
I'm so sorry I scared you.
It's okay. She chuckled. So, you like to run? She squeezed her eyes shut. Sorry, stupid question. Laughing, Pierce shrugged it off.
You're good. Yeah, I wrestled in high school, and from there it just stuck.
I was on the track team. She glanced at the trail ahead and back to Pierce. Would you mind some company? Mind? More like winning the lottery.
Sure.
They started together and fell into a nice rhythm. They'd gone a few miles before Bethany shot him a glance. So, tell me about yourself.
Well, I own a company that purchases businesses on the verge of bankruptcy, goes through their operations, and then builds a plan to help them be successful.
You don't slice and dice them?
He panted a laugh. No, I didn't like that idea.
Is that how you... She winced.
Made my money?
Nodding, she replied, That's tacky, but yeah. Off to the side, he spotted a rock he'd used as a kid when he wanted to think and be alone. He eased to a stop and pointed to it.
Care to take a short break?
Yeah. She smiled. Funny, this is where I'd come to think when I was younger. Still do.
Then we have one more thing in common.
He took a seat on the rock, facing a valley with mountains lining the horizon.
I came here a lot as a kid.
She sat a few feet from him and brought her knees to her chest. It's peaceful out here. Laying her head on her knees, she looked at him. I have to know you. There's just no way I don't. How many times did you vacation here?
Every year from the time I turned 5, so about 7 years.
Part of him just wanted to confess and get it over with, but that desire didn't outweigh the hope that she might remember him. Lifting her head, her gaze seemed to roam his face, and then she grumbled, So frustrating. She shook her head. Okay, so you're successful enough that you bought a town, and you said you have a company that helps other companies. Is that what you've always done?
No,
he said and cleared his throat.
I created a tech startup. It became incredibly popular, and then I sold it. Then I started my current company. A few wise investments helped as well. A couple of years ago, I got my Billionaire Club pass.
It wasn't something he bragged about or spoke of often, but he didn't want her to accuse him of hiding any more than his first name. Her eyes grew wide. You're a billionaire?
Yeah, but I learned a long time ago that money means nothing. I mean, it's easy for me to say that because I have it, but that's part of the reason I started this company. Most companies fail in their first 2 years because their owners don't anticipate what could go wrong. I help with that.
He smiled. Wow, that's not what I expected. I figured tons of women and fancy trips. She winced. I keep putting my foot in my mouth. Pierce laughed.
You're fine.
He cleared his throat.
No hordes of women or trips. Coming to Luck Lake is the first vacation I've taken in years. The last one was to Florida when my parents renewed their vows.
Stretching her legs out, Bethany smiled. That's sweet. How long have your parents been married?
They were married 32 years. But my dad died in a car crash earlier this year. I'm hoping to have the hotel renovated by Thanksgiving so my mom can come here to celebrate the holiday.
Her mouth dropped open and she leaned over, placing her hand on his arm. I'm so sorry.
Don't drink and drive.
The words whooshed out of him in an effort to keep the emotion out of his voice.
Not him. The other driver.
He quickly added.
It's still raw. One of the reasons I bought the town was to feel connected to him again.
It bugs me that I don't remember you. If you were this sweet then, it makes me wonder if I was a snob or something. Bethany chewed her lip. I don't think I was, or I wasn't Pierce held up his hand.
I looked a lot different then, and you were pretty and popular. You had guys almost fighting over who got to be close to you.
She tilted her head. I don't remember it being like that.
All the guys loved you. You were outgoing, friendly, sweet, funny.
He stopped short, embarrassment lighting up his stomach to the point of hurting. No, keep going. She shot him a cheesy grin. Rolling his eyes, he laughed.
Funny. You were, though. Still are. You just had this way about you. This light seemed to shine from your core. It was effortless to like you.
Bethany blinked a few times. Are you being serious?
Well, yeah.
That's funny. I never felt that way. I was so plain. My legs were too long, my hair was stringy, and I hated my skin at the time. I didn't have pimples like most kids my age, but when I ate sugar, they were awful. It was shocking to hear her say that, and also enlightening. Was there a chance he'd seen his past incorrectly too? After all this time, maybe his past wasn't as clear as his memory made him believe. Chapter 6. Showered and dressed, Bethany carried 2 tall glasses of lemonade to her front porch. If anyone would have told her she would be inviting the guy who bought her town over to share a drink with her, she would have laughed in their face. Not only was that exactly what she was doing, but she was nearly giddy with anticipation. They'd finished their run and had a chat at their spot, what she'd started calling it after the first few days they'd jogged together. And she hadn't wanted the evening to end. She liked Chuck, or whatever his name was. From movies and music to milk duds and their popcorn, the number of things they had in common had grown to the point that there was no keeping track of them anymore. I hope you like it, she said, handing the glass to him before taking a seat in one of the rocking chairs. I try not to make mine too sweet. Chuck took a tentative sip and then took a long drink.
It's fantastic.
After another greedy sip, his glass was nearly empty.
And hits the spot.
She sipped hers as she smiled. Thanks.
Thanks for inviting me.
It was an easy invite. She enjoyed his company. He was so easy to talk to, so sweet and kind. The first couple of days, when she wasn't working at the store, she'd strolled to the hotel to spy on the construction, and he'd welcomed her with a cheery smile, even going so far as to ask her to stay because he valued her opinion. Valued, her heart squealed. When had anyone ever said that to her? Never. Until she met Chuck, that is. The billionaire who acted nothing like she would have expected someone with that sort of money to behave. The first few days after finding that out, she wondered what a man like him saw in her. She was a nobody from a small town. He had to be used to fancier things and more refined, better-dressed women. But that's not how he'd made her feel at all. Actually, he made her feel wanted and special, and that feeling grew the more time she spent with him. I've really enjoyed our talks. Plus, I thought you might like to see my house. Mr. Floof took that moment to saunter outside, rub his body against Chuck's leg, and then jump in his lap.
Well, you certainly live up to your name. Large, white, and poofy.
Chuck grinned as he patted the cat's fluff. He loves everyone. Chuck feigned mock pain and clutched his chest.
He's supposed to hate everyone, and it's endearing that he likes me. Don't you know that?
Laughing, Bethany set her lemonade on the small table between them. Sorry, I'll try to remember that next time.
You should,
Chuck replied as he stroked her cat's head.
He's sweet.
That made 2 sweet guys in her life. Well, her brother, but he didn't count. What are your plans once the hotel is renovated? Other things needed to be done as well, but they wouldn't take near as long. Then Bethany realized what she'd asked. If her head grew any hotter, it would melt on her shoulders. Shrugging, Chuck finished his lemonade and set the glass down.
I don't know. Once it gets closer to being complete, I'll turn my attention to other things. I'd like to offer horseback riding and get a few shops open to entice more people to open stores, so Luck Lake has a solid main street. Some more restaurants. People have to have a reason to come here and stay.
Those are some of the things I wanted to do, too.
Really?
He asked, a cute, lopsided smile lifting his lips. That smile. He didn't give it often, but when he did, it sparked a recognition just out of reach for her to latch onto. That smile was one she'd seen before. She just needed to somehow remember the face it went with. She nodded. Yeah, I wanted to have a gazebo built at the end of the dock so we could maybe do weddings, too. He twisted a little in his rocking chair to face her.
I hadn't thought of that, but it's a great idea. Maybe more like a pavilion, though, with swings and spots to sit and enjoy the lake. I'd sure enjoy that. Especially if it was with someone I liked.
His gaze locked with hers, and with a whoosh, the air in her lungs was gone. The vision playing before her was so strong she could practically smell the wedding cake. She could see it, though, and the thought filled her with peace. Oh, what was she doing? Nearly a week of talking to a guy didn't mean she would marry him. Was she really that desperate? No. But it didn't feel desperate to think that way either. Chuck was a great guy, the kind most women would love to meet, and here he was, sitting on her front porch, mirroring the same want in his eyes as she felt. Your idea is even better. She pulled her gaze from his, hoping it would help slow her pulse. I know I've said it before, but I love the plans you have for the hotel.
Well, you've made them better. The suggestion to add a small water park instead of just having a pool was brilliant. I think that will be a huge draw.
He began to yawn and quickly covered his mouth with his hand and stood.
Oh, sorry. Getting up early and going to bed late is wearing me out.
He laughed. I'm sorry. Chuck reached down and took her hand, pulling her to her feet.
Sorry? For what? I'd pull all-nighters if it meant being with you.
He set her hand over his heart and covered it with his own.
Totally worth it.
Gulp. Another thing never said to her. I really like you. It was perhaps the lamest thing she could say, but anything more than that seemed too fast. It didn't feel fast, though. They'd talked for hours. She knew more about him than she'd known about her last boyfriend, and she'd dated him for over a year.
I like you too,
he said softly, holding her gaze with a smoldering look that sent chills down her spine. He squeezed her hand and stepped back, letting their tangled fingers hang between them.
I'll see you tomorrow, okay?
Tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. At this rate, he'd own all of them. Chapter 7. Shaking out his hands, Pierce worked to slow his racing heart, and then knocked. He'd been so close to kissing Bethany the night before, especially after she'd said she liked him. He just didn't want to jump the gun. The process of getting to know her was just as exciting as the prospect of kissing her. Mostly, he'd wanted to save that for their date, hoping to seal the end of the night with it. The door opened, and all of his thoughts of waiting turned into a whisper. Bethany was just wow.
I've never seen a more beautiful woman in my life.
Her cheeks turned a soft pink as she smoothed out the front of her fitted black dress. Lifting her gaze to his, she smiled. That can't possibly be true. Taking her hand, he tugged her to him, wrapping his arm around her.
I would never lie about that.
Whatever ideas he had about ending the date with a kiss took a hike. His heart thundered in his chest, and he leaned forward, pressing his lips to hers. That tiny brush of the lips lit a fire in his soul, and he kissed her again. This time, her arm circled his neck as her body erased the little bit of space between them. His dreams were nothing compared to this. They could have been in 3D and never given him even a glimpse of the passion he felt for her, or what he felt in return. It wasn't just him kissing her. She was returning it with as much desire as he was giving. As her lips parted, he deepened the kiss and wished he could spend the rest of the night holding her and kissing her. The hunger in his heart eclipsed any want or need for food. An eternity of this wouldn't be enough. His phone rang, and they slowly broke the kiss. "Do you need to get that?" she asked while continuing soft kisses along his jaw.
Probably, but I don't want to.
He planted light kisses on her neck, ending them at the spot behind her ear.
I'd rather ignore it and kiss you.
I'd be okay with that. She ran her lips from his jaw back to his lips, covering them with hers. He'd return the call in a second. Or tomorrow. This time she took charge of the kiss, and by the time it slowed, he felt dizzy from lack of oxygen. Taking her ear in his lips, he nibbled on it, and she took a sharp breath before a deep groan poured from her. He tucked that knowledge away for the next time.
We have a reservation at Bella's,
he said as he buried his face in her neck. Apparently, the woman who owned it could see what was coming and had moved to a town an hour from Luck Lake. With a sigh, she pressed her lips to his cheek. I've known her since I was a kid. If we're late, she'll skin me alive. She giggled as he rubbed the tip of his nose across the side of her neck.
I certainly wouldn't want that to happen.
Reluctantly, he leaned back, admiring the flush in Bethany's cheeks.
I guess that means we should go.
With a small pout, she nodded. Okay. The short ride to the restaurant was filled with holding hands, quick kisses, and his heart lighter and happier than it had been in years. Pierce used to hate the word love because it felt so overused these days. But he'd fallen for her. He couldn't picture spending forever with anyone else. Didn't want to, either. He wanted her, and only her. Once they were parked at the restaurant, Bethany slid across the seat of his Bronco, took his face in her hands, and kissed him. "We have 10 minutes. I've set my alarm." She giggled as she leaned back. Another thing he loved about her. The spark of mischief she'd have in her eyes. He wanted that for the rest of his life, too.
An alarm, huh?
Slowly, she nodded, capturing her bottom lip in her teeth as she smiled. Uh-huh. 10 minutes wasn't nearly long enough, but he'd take what he could get. He crushed his lips to hers, pulling her as close as he could in the truck. Her kisses were better than the most expensive wine he'd ever had. She'd left him breathless with want and need. When the alarm sounded, he groaned. He wanted more of her. Keeping one arm around her, he pushed his door open, and as he stepped out, he brought her with him. Once he shut the door, he gave her a quick kiss and laced his fingers with hers.
"I like your skin where it is."
Her cheeks turned darker as she giggled. Then he realized what he'd said, and it was his turn to feel the burn of embarrassment.
"I didn't mean that the way it sounded."
She kissed him. "I know. That's what makes it so funny."
"Oh, yeah?"
He lightly tapped the tip of her nose with his finger. "Yep, you're cute when you blush." What he felt had to be pure. He'd never had this peace with another woman. He couldn't remember ever wanting a woman as much as he wanted her. The word love meant something to him, and all of it was directed at Bethany Holland. He couldn't imagine wanting a future with anyone as much as he wanted one with her. Chapter 8. Stopping in front of the hotel, 2 cups of coffee and a bag of muffins in hand, Bethany swept her gaze from one side to the other. It amazed her what a month and a half could change. The crew working on it was massive. When Chuck said he planned to get it operational as quickly as possible, he'd meant it. Taking the steps, she reached a small table near the entrance and set the 2 cups on it. By now, Chuck would already be up and working with Ash. It had taken her by surprise the first time she'd caught him behaving like a regular crew member, but he'd said he loved to work. As much as she liked him, though, 6 in the morning wasn't her jam. 8 was plenty early, and it was a good time to take a break, have something to eat with some coffee, and talk about how things were going. She pushed open the door and smiled at the grandeur of the lobby. It had been finished a few days ago, and even without a designer's touch, it was already better than she'd ever envisioned. Chuck's voice brought her attention to the office nestled behind the front desk, and she walked to the open door.
"You need to visit this place. We can have a campfire on the lake. I know from experience that it's awesome,"
he said. Just then, a perky female voice responded. "We'll catch up the next time I'm in town, and you can tell me all about it."
"All right,"
Chuck laughed. "Good luck," the woman replied. "Talk soon." She made kissy sounds, and the line died. He turned, and Bethany froze. Sorry. I promise I just heard the last part of the conversation."
"It's okay. That was a friend of mine from college, Hadley Shaw. She's the one who helped me with the purchase of the town."
He smiled.
I need to talk to you about something."
He crossed the small room and stood in front of her.
"First, I need to head home. I'm not sure how long I'll be gone because it has to do with my company and it's a fairly complex issue. I'm hoping it's only a few days."
"Oh." She swallowed hard, hoping the panic rising in her chest couldn't be seen on her face. "Okay."
"I want you to come with me."
He paused and quickly added,
"If you can. Do you think Matt would be okay with that?"
He held her gaze.
"Are you okay? You don't have to come. If you can, I'd like it. You can meet my mom. She's been a little lonely since I left, and I'm sure she'd love the company."
It was hard to breathe. All this time, she'd wondered how serious their relationship might be. And now that he was inviting her to meet his mom, panic flooded her veins like she was being locked in a small box. Until now, it hadn't been real. They had lives, and she knew eventually he'd leave. She certainly didn't want to force him to choose her, and she couldn't leave Luck Lake. At least that was what her head was saying. She was ignoring her screaming heart. "I can't. I'm sorry." Chuck's lips turned down for a fraction of a second.
"It's okay. It was rude to wait until the last minute to tell you, but everything happened rather quickly."
"You're sweet, and I appreciate the offer." She chuckled nervously. Actually, I was coming to tell you I couldn't have breakfast this morning. Matt is sick, and I need to tend to the store." It was the first thing that came to mind, and she hated that she just lied to him. That wasn't her, but she was tongue-tied. "I left drinks and muffins on the table by the front door."
"Oh, okay, well, I guess I need to go then. I need to pack, and my flight leaves in a couple of hours."
"Okay. Call or text me so I know you arrived safely," she said, backing away from him. She nodded toward the direction of the store. "Better get going."
"Sure."
It was barely from his lips before she was sprinting from the hotel. She wasn't sure how she felt, but dissolving into a puddle of tears wasn't how she handled things. Cold turkey was better for this sort of thing anyway. It ripped the Band-Aid off, and the healing could start. In a fog of tears and puffy eyes, Bethany used the back of her hand to wipe her face as she looked from the picture on her laptop to her phone. Chuck's conversation with his friend Hadley had triggered Bethany's memory of the campfires by the lake when she was a kid. Each summer, her aunt took a picture of all the guests, and she'd post them on the wall in the lobby. It had taken a little digging, but she'd found a memory stick with all her aunt's pictures on it. Pierce Westwood. That's why he'd seemed so familiar. Why his smile and his laughter gave her comfort. He'd had skin problems like all the other kids, thick glasses and unruly hair, but he was also funny and sweet. She may not have crushed on him then, but she absolutely remembered him. It had been a little more than a week since Pierce had left, and she'd been an emotional mess the entire time. The few times he'd texted, she'd responded with something short and simple. Should she call him and tell him she missed him? More importantly, that she remembered him. A knock came on her door.
"Bethany, what is going on with you?" her brother asked.
"Go away, Matt." It was a half-hearted answer. The door opened and Matt walked in.
"What is going on with you?" he repeated.
"Nothing."
"Your couch is littered with tissue, and 3 empty half-gallon ice cream tubs are sitting on your kitchen counter. Why are you here? You care about him. I know it. You know it. The people who've stopped at the store know it. Every other sentence is Chuck this or that."
"His name is Pierce." Matt's eyes narrowed as he tried to put the name with Chuck's face. Bethany swiveled her laptop to show him the picture. "That's him," she said, pointing to the average-height kid in the middle row. "That's Pierce, a.k.a. Chuck." Her brother collapsed on the couch next to her and took the laptop.
"Oh yeah, he was a cool kid."
He looked at her.
"And you love the guy."
Love? It was the first time she'd allowed the word to fully form in her mind. Now that it was there, it was bringing the most peace she'd felt in a week. She'd fallen in love with him, but it was such a short time. What if she was wrong? What if...
Are a chicken.
I'm not! She pouted. He has his life and I have mine. He rolled his eyes.
Bethany, go get Chuck. He loves Luck Lake enough that he purchased it. I'd bet money he loves you too. You could see it when he looked at you. You're just too afraid to admit that you love him.
You think he loves me? The word love had pinged around in her head since the moment she saw him leave town in Ash's truck. But admitting it when he was going home was terrifying. Really?
Yeah, sis, I do. Go, find him, tell him you love him, and grab that happily ever after. Whether it's here or there, it doesn't matter. This town can't hold you at night or return your love.
She held her brother's gaze a fraction of a second and nodded. Yeah, I really do love him. I don't think I can live without him.
Then get dressed so you can tell him that.
Okay, give me an hour. Book me a flight to Texas? She'd figure out how to find Pierce when she got there. Yeah, she could call, but she wanted to see him, to tell him how she felt about him, to show him that she was sorry for being scared.
Done.
He smiled as he pulled out his phone.
I'll see you in a minute.
It was scary putting her heart into someone's hand and hoping they were gentle with it. But she had to risk it. If she didn't, it would break anyway. Chapter 9. The second he arrived in Luck Lake, Pierce's heart began racing at a dizzying speed. When he'd left, he intended to introduce his mom to Bethany and then tell her he loved her. Of course, he knew it wasn't necessary, but having his mom's blessing meant something to him. He chuckled quietly to himself. Once his mom knew, she'd practically forced him to return to Luck Lake. One of the reasons for his return was to resign from the board so he could focus on his new venture with the love of his life. Or so he hoped. It had spooked him when Bethany ran from him, though. Being on the verge of pouring his heart out to her and seeing the fear in her eyes made him stop short. What if he told her and she didn't feel the same way? He texted her, but telling her how he felt wasn't something he wanted to do over the phone. Like something out of a movie, a truck passed him on the road to Luck Lake, and his gaze followed it until it came to a stop. The passenger door swung open, and Bethany was flagging him down. He slammed on the brakes and put the car in park, quickly throwing the door open.
Bethany?
For a second, he was stunned. His feet and his brain were at least working together as he helped close the gap.
What are you doing?
I was getting a ride from Matt to the airport. Tears trickled down her cheeks as she flung her arms around his neck. She leaned back. I didn't know when you were coming back, and a smile lifted her lips. I remember you, Pierce. You were sweet and funny.
That's about all I had going for me. I wasn't exactly a catch back then.
See, that's just it. I remember being gangly and awkward and uninterested in boys. You always had people laughing. You were so easy to be around. Laughing, he set his forehead against hers.
I guess the past isn't all that cut and dry sometimes.
He pulled back to look at her.
Why were you coming to see me?
Hope fluttered in his chest, knowing what he wanted the answer to be. When you invited me home, it scared me. You have a life, and I didn't want to leave Luck Lake because it's my home, but I've been miserable without you. Home isn't home if you aren't there. Tears sparkled in the sun and then slipped down her cheeks. I fell in love with you, and I don't care where I get to love you as long as I get to love you. Smiling, he felt like his whole body sighed in relief.
I left to take care of business because I was resigning as chairman of my company.
What? I didn't want that.
I didn't do it for you. I did it for me. I loved Luck Lake as a kid, which is why I bought it. I'd planned to visit from time to time. Maybe retire here one day.
She chewed her bottom lip. But he touched his lips to hers.
Bethany, I had a crush on you as a kid, and getting to know you has turned that into so much more. I love you and your heart. So not only do I get to spend my days in a place I love, but I get to share it with someone I love.
He cupped her cheek with one hand, wiping her tears away with his thumb.
I love you, and I don't care where that is as long as I have you.
She circled her arms around his neck. I love you, and I feel the same way. Wherever you are, I'm happy. Pressing his lips to hers, he found himself drowning in the comfort of having her in his arms. Another soft brush of her lips, and he deepened the kiss, hoping to give her a tiny glimpse of the love he felt for her. His heart belonged to her, and she'd hold it the rest of his life. When they finally broke the kiss, he gasped for air as he touched his forehead to hers. After a few deep breaths, he smiled.
I love you with everything I am. There is nothing in this world I want more than you.
Leaning back a small fraction, she nodded. Nothing. Not even this town. I don't want anything but you. Balling her hands in his shirt collar, she held his gaze a moment. My heart belongs to you. She pulled his lips down to hers, and this time it was more than fireworks. The need and desire he felt coming from her matched his own. She was his, and he was hers. Whatever the future brought, they'd handle it together. Epilogue. Thanksgiving, the same year. Sitting next to Matt with Pierce's mom, Gia, across from her, Bethany glanced from one end of the large dining table to the other, in awe of the meal they were about to share. A massive turkey with a half-dozen sides, with desserts waiting in the kitchen as well. Not only were her aunt and uncle there, but a few of Pierce's aunts and uncles too. It had been so long since they'd had a huge family get-together, and now she realized just how much she'd missed it. They'd invited Ash, but he had family he would be spending the holiday with. In the last 4 months, her relationship with Pierce was stronger than ever and growing more so every day. The hotel had been finished, and the designer Pierce had hired had kept her word, preserving the cozy warmth of the past while giving it a facelift. The deep browns, rustic reds, and earthy oranges seemed to hug Bethany every time she stepped foot in the place. Pierce caught her gaze and smiled.
I just want to say I'm thankful for everyone being here. Not only to celebrate the holiday, but to celebrate the completion of the hotel.
Gia covered his hand with hers. Your dad would be so proud.
I think so.
Bethany's Aunt Faye nodded. You've done a marvelous job. It's incredible. Thank you for letting us stay here. Pierce grinned.
I'm so glad you came.
He looked from her aunt to Bethany, holding her gaze a few moments.
Luck Lake was a childhood escape, a place I loved visiting, and it's given me more than I ever could have imagined.
He stood, came around the edge of the table, and bent down, taking Bethany's face in his hands.
I love you. You are the best thing to ever happen to me.
Her mouth dropped open as he went to one knee and pulled a small box from his pant pocket. What? When he flipped the lid open, A ring sat in the middle of the box with a round diamond surrounded by more tiny diamonds.
You're the only person I want. I love your smile and your laughter and your wit. You fill my life with happiness and joy. I don't want to take another step forward in this journey without you by my side. Would you please marry me?
She sucked in a long breath, her hand coming to her mouth as she nodded. Yes! The moment it was out of her mouth, the room erupted into cheers and clapping. He slid the ring on her finger, and as he stood, he pulled her with him, wrapping her in his arms.
It was probably a little old-fashioned, but I told your family I planned to ask.
She hugged him around the neck. I would have said yes either way.
You are the only one I want. I love you.
I love you. Of all the times he'd kissed her, this one was the sweetest. It held more than love or want. It held promises and a future together. Something she couldn't picture with anyone but Pierce. This has been The Billionaire's Crush, Luck Lake Short Reads Romance. Written by Bree Livingston, narrated by Liz Crane. Copyright 2020 by Elizabeth Jane McKay. Production copyright by Elizabeth Jane McKay.